All right, well, welcome everyone to another CPSS Prep webinar. Thank you all for joining us today. My name is Daniel Yu. I'm a sports scientist and strength coach for the Orlando Magic, and I'm joined here by my co-host, Nick.
Welcome, everyone. Thank you guys for hopping on. Again, my name is Nick Simi. I'm a physical therapist and athletic trainer for the Charlotte Hornets.
Awesome. And I'm super excited to
Hmm.
introduce our guest speaker today. We have Cory Kennedy, who previously served as the Director of Performance for the Sacramento Kings and Head of Strength and Conditioning and Performance Science for the Chicago Cubs organization. Cory also co-authored the Kinetics and Force Platforms chapter in the NSCA Essentials of Sports Science textbook. With him, he brings a tremendous amount of practical experience and is honestly the perfect person to show us how the concepts from his chapter are applied in the real world setting. So super grateful to have him here today. If you have any questions during the call, feel free to save them for the end and you can ask Cory or put them in the chat and Nick and I will save them for the end and help moderate. And with that, I'll pass it over to Cory. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Daniel and Nick. Thanks for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here. It's also a pleasure to have co-written this chapter for the textbook. It was quite an honor at the time to be asked. I co-wrote it with Daniel Cohen. I'm not sure how many of you know who Daniel Cohen is, but he co-founded ForceDex. When I first met him, ForceDex still wasn't part of Vault. Vault later bought it, and it was the first real you know, consumer available software that was had auto detection, which I'll touch on later, and things that made it a lot easier for people to use. And so when I got a chance to write with him, it was a super great honor and happy how this turned out. It's still, I was talking to Nick and Daniel about the process of writing a textbook. It often takes years for your work to actually get out into the hands of people from all the edits and going through things to when it finally gets published. But I think the product is still really apt today, or even more apt because of how popular force platforms have become. So I'm going to talk about the structure of the chapter a little bit, but I'm going to expand beyond just force plates to the concepts that I talk about. It's also pretty surface level because of time. This is a short webinar today, so I'm not getting into any actual data, but keeping it conceptual. If you guys want to talk a little bit about data, put in the questions, I can touch on it, but I'm not going to share any actual uh, data for the moment. With that, would that go? So the agenda is going to follow a little bit of how the chapter was structured, even though I'm not just repeating the chapters here. I'm going to talk some intro and basics of force plates and why force platforms and why they're so popular now and why they're a gold standard, even though there's a chance that other things start to take some of that place. We're going to talk about profiling and benchmarking, load response, and rehabilitation and return to play. But first, we're going to talk about Sherlock Holmes and what makes Sherlock special. So he has like his irascible wit and he makes all these funny observations. But the biggest thing is that he is just constantly looking at a lot of different observations and connecting them in patterns. So his big ability is seeing all these patterns. And that's really what sports science is in professional sports. You want these clean cut answers, and it just doesn't work that way. I had a front office member one time said to me, okay, if we want to sort of load manage players, like how do we know exactly this person needs a rest? Like what's the definition? And at first I wanted to just say, well, there's not one definition. It's pretty ambiguous. We're looking at signal from A, B, C, D, E, F, G. But that challenged me and our team to make some definitions, right? Develop some cutoff points, develop, okay, if this is elevated, what does that say? What if that's elevated and this is depressed and this is elevated? And kind of create a workaround of if-thens that helped guide our work. But the point is that our exact formula could be different than what Daniel's doing, what Luis is doing, what anyone else in this call is doing in their daily work, and they could all be correct in their own way. So it's not necessarily about having the exact right cutoffs for data, but understanding conceptually, how am I looking at patterns to create information. Also, we want to kind of find out who is the best Sherlock. And feel free to put this in the chat. We have the BBC Sherlock with Benedict Cumberbatch. We've got Robert Downey Jr. in the movies. And there's the new young Sherlock. I don't know if you guys have checked that out with Hero Finds Tiffin. So there's three options. There's probably some old Sherlocks that I'm not aware of before my time, but feel free to vote on which is your favorite Sherlock. With that, we're going to get into introduction to force platforms, some history and basics. This is super high level, but when I started in this field, they were really just using university labs and with biomechanics experts. So you had things like Kistler, AMTI, Burtech that had these large, very, very expensive, but very, very high quality plates that were anywhere from $25,000 to $100,000. With that money, most places didn't buy them. So you usually had them in these very specific settings for very specific projects. They were also simple in that what they record is really just force in as many axes as the force plate can allow. So up to 3, obviously. Some cheaper force plates now to save money, just check vertical forces. But otherwise, you'd have your 3 planes of horizontal, vertical, and lateral, and time. So the actual raw data is not complicated, but back then, those systems, they just converted everything and you just had CSV of, forces and moments per unit time going down. So it was a complex spreadsheet that you could figure out, but you had to do a lot of work to get to a place of actually deciding what to do with that data. So it's one thing to have it, but then it's another to say, okay, if I want to make judgments about how someone jumped, or, an example, when I was working in the Olympic system, when I first got there, we had a biomechanist that was doing things like measuring turns in swimmers. So putting the actual force plate on the wall in the pool and looking at turns. But if you just collect force time data, there's a lot of work to, get the curves, draw it out, look at the timing, look at what's normal to then decide, how am I going to bring this information to sports and athletes? So back then, force plates were somewhat simple, but a lot of work to get to any real meaningful information that you could use for coaching and skill analysis. Force X and Hawk and Dynamics came around, and that's only been about 10 years. And with that, there's a ton of stuff. One, they made the plates cheaper. So now you can get plates around $10,000 or less, which now a lot of people can justify in their budgets. But the big thing is auto detection algorithms. So the first system that we had built in our Olympic Center in Montreal, we hand built in MATLAB, but we had to define, okay, here's a jump. This is what these points mean. This is what this point means. We had to write it all in code, and it was bulky. It was awkward, but we made it work, and we were proud of it. But then all of a sudden, these systems came around, and you press record, you press stop, and it says, "This is your jump. It was a counter movement jump. Here's all the points," and it does that automatically. And that was such an incredible change for the average user. And now we even have the back end. So you now have Hawken involved where you can collect very easy because of auto detection. But then when you finish collecting, you can now go into their portals, and most of them in the cloud have all these different ways of visualizing the data as well over time. And so many of the barriers to using these force platforms have disappeared to now almost anyone can get in, record data, and look at it without knowing too much and being able to learn on the fly as they go. Also, because they seem fancy, because they're highly technological, they're also very simple. Like I said before, the value really comes from the fact that they're measuring the force applied to it, but at these extremely high sampling rates. So usually it's set at 1,000 hertz, and most research, you'll see them quoting 1,000 hertz. That's 1,000 samples per second, but this could go up to 2,000. So even though they're simple slabs of metal, the high resolution is what allows us to intuit different patterns of force application that are going to tell stories of what's going on. And that's made them the gold standard for measuring most of our strength and power qualities. Although with magnetic resistance and different things like that. We're starting to see ways where you can get force in either isometric or isokinetic conditions in the field that are also becoming cheaper. So those are going to start to be used a lot as well, but that doesn't make the force platforms any less valuable. So with profiling and benchmarking, monitoring is super cool. Like you hear a lot of people thinking and talking through the idea of monitoring athletes day to day and being able to really understand what's going on. But profiling and benchmarking to me are way more important. So when we're talking about this, we're talking about establishing levels of performance for your sport that are potentially deterministic. Obviously, every sport has different levels of determinism that we're able to get from data off the court or pitch, but that's always our goal. The first thing is that you have to have clear standards, guidelines, cueing positions for your measurements because you want to be able to make judgments on the changes in data and not worry that, well, it was actually mismeasured or he was in a different position or different person did it or the timing is off. So that's number one with everything. And with profiling and baseline, we're usually talking about tests that are done less frequently, like monthly or quarterly. So you really don't want to mess it up and have this massive gap of data where now you don't have data for, say, half a year because you just messed up that testing. One, you want to check the research for norms for your sport for some of these tests, but don't be afraid to make your own. Every time a person collects data in their context on their sport with their individuals, there is some bias that's not going to always generalize to everyone in that sport. So you want to make sure that you're constantly updating your own data sets to make sure you understand what are the benchmarks for my population. And I can't stress this enough, but you also want to think about not just the benchmarks you see, but can you start to hypothesize on what it would take to be elite? We've all been in places where you sometimes enter an environment and you're collecting data and your team isn't very good. That's just the reality of sports. There's winners and losers. And so if you're collecting a ton of data and making benchmarks on your current population and you look around and let's say we're talking about the NBA because Nick and Daniel invited me in and I was there as well. If you're a bottom 5 team right now, you may not have the exact population of what you want from a top 4 team. And so you may have some benchmarks, but you may say, hey, I actually think we're going to want 3 more guys that are these elite level jumpers. So that would technically move all of our averages up when we're a championship team. So make your own, and keep in mind as you're updating them that you want to also keep the option open that like, hey, if we're going to be champions, is there a chance that we're hitting another level of performance that I don't see yet? And in certain tests you might. So with profile and benchmarking, these are our KPIs. And with KPIs, normally I like to just refer to them as indicators, so measures of performance, but sometimes they're also inhibitors. And so I'm going to get to that shortly, but these are the metrics that you're constantly referencing with your sporting, front office coaches as things that are guiding you to judge your performance. They require continued R&D. So as you get more data sets and newer modeling techniques, share with other people, you might continue to get more and more hypotheses out of these data. Because again, as I mentioned before, this category, profile and benchmarking, this is the stuff that you're hoping determines performance. This is the stuff that you're tracking to see if a player is ready to be that elite level performance in the sport that you need. So the force platform versions of profiling are usually jumps. Sometimes in some sports, you might do a broad variety of tests in jumping. In others, maybe CMJ is the only one you use. You have squat jumps, counter movement jumps. Both of these can be done with load as well. Drop jumps, CMJ rebound tests, hop tests, and then various strength measures, the most common ones, isometric mid-thigh pulls, belt squats, different positional isos. This could be like standing seated calf or prone supine hamstring tests and ASH. So I've done different positions. I really like the overhead if you only had to pick one. Some real examples of what this really, how you apply this type of testing. So column on the left is sport specific performance. So this is when I think about KPIs as key performance indicators. So as I mentioned, these are measures that are correlated to success in sport. For example, in hockey skating, I've helped publish some literature and seen some things, and I know that we could say sprint speed off ice has a very high correlation to hockey skating speed. So that might be a test where if you're working in hockey, you might be checking, your off ice sprints at a regular basis because you expect that to transfer to skating. Baseball hitting might be CMJ power output. High power usually leads to high bat speed, which leads to success on the field. So again, it's not perfect that you can say just because he's powerful, he's going to hit 45 home runs, but you're creating a threshold of, I know we're probably going to need this much power output if we expect this player to do that. I used to work with springboard diving back in the Olympics, and we had standards for jump height for different events because every dive starts with a jump. So if you can't jump a certain height, it almost is going to limit the degree of difficulty you can now put into dives. So those are all indicators of a potential performance. Whereas on the injury prevention and resilience side, these are things I think of more as inhibitors, where you're more worried about the downside risk. So standards for conditioning, joint-specific strength, or general strength. For example, baseball throwing, there's a ton of research in it, constantly looking at internal, external rotation, ash strength. Most of the time, you're not going to look at it and say, I'm going to keep increasing these to infinity, but rather, if you don't meet a standard, that maybe is a category of risk where we're worried about your resilience to throw a baseball. With team sports, it could be repeat sprint or aerobic base. So basic conditioning tests. I know early in my career, working in one sport, we did preseason testing sort of on the first day where there's still going to be cuts to be made. And there were a couple athletes that were so far off of our conditioning score that, the discussion with the coaching group was just, unless this player is the most skilled player you've ever seen, the catch up for them to be able to contribute in practice every day, handle the rigors of training camp, handle the density schedule, is going to just take too long, that they're going to be a problem. And so, again, it has nothing to do with their skill. This is related to their resilience and their ability to kind of keep up with the demands of the sport. And basketball could be one where, there's a lot of concern out there about calf strains and obviously Achilles tears. And so you might have a standard on seated calf iso strength, for example. I'm not giving you exact numbers, but it wouldn't be inconceivable to say, hey, I want all my guys to have this minimum standard of strength as a resilience injury prevention piece. Again, this isn't predicting performance. That's for other things. Like you might say a basketball player's ability to jump high or reactively is probably going to be more related to how explosively they play on the court, but this could be related to injury prevention and resilience. So going back to Sherlock, the patterns that we're talking about when we're talking about profiling benchmarking, what do the most successful athletes do? And you're constantly trying to refine your testing, refine the data and the models you use to say, can I make these quick judgments when I profile to say, yes, my athlete's in a good spot, or no, we need to help them improve. And every once in a while, sometimes, do we have to cut an athlete, and what is that criteria? Second category is load response monitoring. So a lot of times we just call this monitoring of daily stuff with athletes. We wanted to make sure we put the term load response in there because it really is looking at how athletes are responding to the different load exposure stimuli that they get in life and sports and everything that's coming around them. That's really what we're looking at. We're not necessarily looking as much, like I said, about those key performance indicators, but really making judgments of how athletes are adapting to stress. So basic lessons on monitoring. It allows us to better apply our training and prep for competition because we obviously want our athletes optimized for comp. It allows us to know, are we there or when are the times that we've seen ourselves get there so that we can do that again. Standardization is also important here, but it's not quite as important to be as rigorous as you did for the profiling benchmarking. The reason I say that is because you were trying to capture good days and bad days, because that helps paint the picture and spectrum of what that athlete goes through on a regular basis, to also understanding context of meaningful change. If you try to never test when an athlete's tired or sore, etc., you are just skewing your own data set to imagine that it's always perfect. What that means is that, if we're talking about CMJ testing in most athletes, especially in a dense competition schedule, it means that you can't always standardize to say my athlete's going to be fresh today when we jump in order to see good results. You can do that with the profiling benchmarking, right? You can give them 2 days off, 3 days off before you say, this is our test day. In this instance, when we're talking about load response monitoring, you're almost wanting to take them as they are. The only exception is you're obviously going to try and warm them up the same, try and make sure it's not like, hey, this test will be skewed because this person just, got up off the floor after sitting for 2 hours, and that's obviously not applicable. Or you don't want to come right out of a game and do it unless you for sure are trying to answer a question about, how much do you tire during a game. But if you're just looking at day-to-day variation, you don't want to eliminate days because you're worried a guy might be tired. You just want to say, get them warm, get them ready, and then you want to see. So I've had different people sometimes say to me, well, we got to make sure it's X number of days after a game so they're not too tired. We got to make sure it's X. And then what you end up doing is you end up missing a lot of signal of how a person actually responds to the different loads. Like, I want to know if an athlete says they feel terrible the morning after the game, I want to know what that looks like. I want to see that sometimes so that I can see it maybe go up the days approaching the next game and say, okay, this is our normal rhythm with normal play. How do we keep working within that? With profiling, we want stable metrics. So a lot of the things I referred to there might have coefficients of variation in like 1, 2, 3%. These are things that don't change much over time, which is good because it gives us a lot of signal that an athlete has truly changed a certain character or quality when they have. When we're talking about monitoring, we want to almost shift to some qualities that are in the 5 to 10% range of CV, because these are things that we know have a certain sensitivity. They're the first indicators when something's different. We don't necessarily want the thing that's 20% CV, and that's where something like RFD comes in. Sometimes people want RFD because the concept is super important. How fast can you produce force? But the way that we typically sample RFD, there's such small windows that the sensitivity is very difficult to judge. So you almost want to find something that's in between 5 to 10%. And there's a lot of papers on this, that the Gathercole papers. He wrote a couple papers on alternative CMJ metrics. Those were kind of the first ones that really outlined the things that change immediately after fatiguing exercise. And Christy Lee Taylor had a few different papers. She was before him. Her PhD dissertation was a whole bunch of different papers around force plate monitoring. So those are two sort of classic studies that really help show those things. But since we're talking about force platforms and monitoring, without me giving a detail of all the metrics that were in the textbook or that you should do, just know that timing, for example, is a huge signal for monitoring. Usually the actual force number is not going to change a lot in athletes. So force application, like strength, are those really stable metrics, but how quickly you can get to different forces are usually going to be the thing. So I'll talk some more about some example variables, but the other thing about CMJ testing that applies really well for monitoring is that it's somewhat easy to teach. Most athletes already know what to do. If not, just cueing them to do so can happen pretty quickly. It's applicable to almost all sports. And even when it's not, I've had examples in the past where it still reflected CNS and neuromuscular changes. So I had a really cool experience in Olympic system where we had, I was working with a Paralympic swimming group, and we had an athlete with cerebral palsy. And so for those that don't know, cerebral palsy involves one side of your body essentially not working very well at times, kind of going through various changes of how much strength you might have or coordination. You might wake up one day and that side of your body is just not nearly as effective as usual. And so we were trying to find out different field tests that could predict or could tell us a bit ahead of practice and such, so that the coach had an awareness of the level of effectiveness this athlete had on the day. And in fact, CMJ limb to limb measures were very predictive of kind of the levels of symptoms that he qualitatively showed. And we were able to also trace that into single leg broad jumping, so that we had a field test that we could do anywhere. And that to me was super cool to find out, like when we picture swimming, 90% of the races, mostly upper body and core. And so it doesn't feel like jumping would be as appropriate, but it still is high demand of your neuromuscular system to just say, I'm going to try and move my center of mass as fast as possible right now. And that just requires that coordination of your whole body that applies to almost every human. So CMJ testing is super popular, and I don't think that's going to change just because it can be applied to almost everybody. A few more items on this. Consistent data is crucial. Like I said, you want as few gaps as possible from the things that you're using to monitor, so that you really can try to capture the effects of different things, whether that's effective game, effective hard practicing, effective strength sessions versus not, effect of travel, effective time change, things like that. You want to start to be able to map out what's happening to all of the athletes that are in your care. We are looking for acute reactions to various stimuli. So these are things that are happening in the short term. Long-term reactions go back to that profiling of over multiple training blocks. But the most important thing about monitoring is just deciding on what meaningful change is to you. And this is why I said at the start in my intro that it can be different for all of us in this call, and it still be okay, and it still be appropriate. You can flag based on effect size or Z-scores, in which case you're only getting numbers, for example, a table of numbers with an effect size and a color, and that can be enough for you to make your decisions. Some people might prefer a visual of, changes over time of a line graph, and you may have, plus and minus one standard deviation or a 90% confidence interval band, and you might be just looking to see when these dots pop out of these key features, right? Those are all different ways that could work for you to say, oh, this is different than I normally see. That's what I'm gonna, use to make my judgments. It is up to the practitioner to decide compared to what as well. So what is your reference range? Every time you compare today's test result to something, you have to decide, what are you packaging up as that something? Because you're going to basically create a mean and a variance that you're seeing what today's change is relative to. And so for most people, they have some sort of rolling window. I've always liked, in basketball, I used a little shorter. It was in the 5 to 7 range because there's so much travel that I feel like you change quickly in terms of what you've been going through. And then in the past, when I was doing Olympic sports, I kept it on like a 2-week window, because with a lot of Olympic sports, you spend most of the year at home training, and then it's only in competition periods where you might go away for these main competitions. So for us back then, 2 weeks was a fairly stable range of normal stimuli that's going on. But you have to kind of look at your environment and say, what makes sense for me to compare to, where the context of that athlete wasn't totally different back then, and that we can't really rely on. So you want to keep the windows relatively short and appropriate. I probably wouldn't go over like 30 days or anything like that for monitoring. Some real examples. I know the chapter was about force plates, but since I want to talk a little bit more about just real life, monitoring is going to have multiple different levers you pull. So if we're talking about the performance outcome of monitoring, we're talking about things on force plates like drop jump, can be RSI, CMJ, things like eccentric duration, FTCT, which is your flight time to contraction time ratio, RSI mod, which is basically the same as your drop jump RSI, but instead of contact time, you're using the full time to take off, since you're not leaving the ground. So that's why they created that mod term. FV0 is one I liked a lot. It is actually the peak force applied in the eccentric range, and usually that's going to change a little bit with your ability to sort of load quickly. So again, even though I mentioned monitoring is really usually about timing. That's a case where sort of force and time interact in a way that's fairly reliable. Then you have subjective wellness questionnaires like Hooper-McKinnon, or different things that say, how do you feel? How sore are you? How did you sleep? Um, how excited are you to train? There's a bunch of different versions like this, but some sort of graded scale that athletes are answering. You have physiological responses like resting heart rate, HRV, omega wave. And then there's other things like, I've put this one first because it was an interesting example. Back when we were at the Olympic Center, we had a summer intern in his bachelor's degree, and we wanted to do a deep dive on monitoring. And we had been doing some different things with Olympians, and so we got this guy who was a recreational but serious weightlifter to track like 20 things. It was super awesome in terms of like this guy was just doing the full science on himself. So he would do his wellness questionnaires, resting heart rate. He did vertical jumps every day. But one of the things we had him do with VBT is we had him warm up, and we chose a reference load. I can't remember if it was 135 or 155, but we chose a reference load that we thought was relatively easy for him to hit each day. But he would basically warm up a certain amount of reps, and then he would do these test sets to see how fast he moves the bar. And at the end, we did a whole bunch of different regression analysis, and we did some PCAs to sort of cluster different elements. And barbell squat velocity for a person who did a lot of weightlifting was actually, very similar to both resting heart rate and CMJ scores as a potential option to monitor how he was feeling on that day and how he was performing. And so that's why I put that example. Not a lot of people will use it in a monitoring way. A lot of people will more use it as a prescribing load way. But I thought that was super interesting that you can always get creative with things that you can measure if you do them in a controlled way to see how they respond. The big thing here that I just want to stress when we're talking about monitoring, we're talking about responses. People are often saying, does this predict fatigue? Or what does this mean about fatigue? And that's terminology I don't like, because these are all showing different things changing due to what happened, but we don't know why, right? We don't know what exactly contributed. We just know that a CMJ change is a change performance on that day, right? We're later going to make judgments like, oh, he's probably tired because this was down, or training's been working, he's fresh, this went up. Subjective wellness is how a person feels, right? Again, that could be stress related, not just fatigue from sport. Physiological responses, again, are similar. That's like your autonomic nervous system probably saying whether it's stress or not. And the other things are performances as well. So try to be careful with your language to tell what's actually happening. And in the case of CMJs, even though they're super popular, we don't know that we're seeing fatigue. We don't know that we're seeing supercompensation. We're just seeing performance. We're seeing performance up, performance down. And that's allowing us to create a narrative back and forth of hopefully what we think happened so that we can predict it going forward. Again, going back to Sherlock, we're looking at patterns in monitoring. And in this case, the pattern that we're really trying to answer is, how does this athlete perform or create movement when they are fresh, right? We're trying to understand what their best performances are and see, okay, are we there? Are we off from it? What is happening? Can we get back to it? And you're making these decisions about all the stimuli that this athlete's exposed to. The third and final category for today is rehab or return to performance. Basic level lessons here on return to performance is that this is a different, basically, version of monitoring, but you're focused a lot more on interlimb changes typically, or sometimes within limb over time. Big thing, you want to choose tests that could be done regularly, like within a day's notice a lot of times, because in a return to play of say 2 to 3 weeks, you want to be able to dose these assessments whenever you feel it's necessary, stay on track without it costing you 3, 4, 5 days because you don't have information. So think about things that you can dose easily, get that that data from without it being too difficult on the athlete that they can't kind of continue the next day, because that'll create problems in the overall RTP process for shorter injuries, especially. Sometimes you're sorting through a combination of timing and force. So sometimes you see that a limb is, say, you're looking at two limbs in a CMJ, one might be getting into the action later, but their forces might end up at the same. So if you're just looked at, concentric force or FV0, they may not be different. But when you look at the traces on top of each other, or like the time, you might notice that there is a difference between, say, this injured limb and non-injured limb in the timing of that force application. Other times timing might be okay, and all of a sudden you see one of them's creating 15% less force. So you really have to kind of look at both things and kind of take a moment to observe before you really guess at what's going on. I know, Nick, being a physical therapist in the NBA, can probably attest to, there's a lot of messiness in an RTP between healing of an injured tissue or insulted tissue, and also the recovery from the exposures you're applying to it, because by definition, we're pretty much trying to grade something new every day. You're elevating your exposures every day to get back to where you were, while at the same time the tissue is healing. And so you're constantly seeing these potential setbacks or not, to decide, is this enough that I can keep going, or is this something bigger than that I need to pause or stop? So that's an aside on RTP, that you really have to look at patterns and zoom out to say, okay, what did we do yesterday? Would that lead to this? What if this was healing well? What if it's not healing well? Like I said, you do want dynamic options like jumping, running, single leg jumping, but you also want a few static options, because they're going to kind of anchor you on the basics of probably that tissue a little bit more than the dynamic. Dynamic is a lot more neuromuscular, so there's a lot of coordination things going on. So you may be able to separate, okay, the tissue's healed enough because maybe on this next line, on the force platform, you're doing maybe seated calf testing, ASH testing, standing calf, or with dynamometry, if you're doing for quad, or maybe Nordic for hamstring, you might be able to say, hey, in my static testing, we're actually pretty close to normal. So the tissue is able to create said force. That might tell us, hey, our actual tissue is getting safe. But in these dynamic tests, you may see that the coordination still isn't there. So the athlete's still not back to their normal self, but it might not be related anymore to like the actual health of the hamstring, for example, or the health of the calf, but rather the entire chain and body being ready to go back to normal. Historical data on the individual is a lot more important than the group here. When we're looking at profiling, the group matters. You're trying to get people up to what standard you think is important for performing in the sport. RTPs, it's really messy. Some people live with a 15% asymmetry on one side. The person beside them in the sport lives with a 18% asymmetry on the other leg. Person beside them is 0-0. Person beside them is 8 on the right, 0 on the left. So you can't really make these general assumptions about what asymmetry a person should be at, but rather when they came in, what were they? Has it been stable over time? If it's been stable over time and now we have an injury, that's probably where we want to get back to. It might move a little bit over return to play because you're maybe focused on stuff that you haven't been focused on before, but you want to get back to that ballpark because that's just their normal. So that's crucial. It's using that individual historical data. Another really important lesson in RTP when looking at data is that reductions in performance could be injury tissue related or inhibition. So like I said, you may find out that the tissue itself can tolerate high load, but doing the dynamic test or higher threshold test might not be done very well. That's just an athlete potential fear or coordination to give their all. I'll give an example of when I was in baseball, we had an athlete with a hamstring return to play, and we used the NORD board a lot in our injury prevention screening and performance testing. And so we had a threshold that was expected for this return to play. And this is, presented at the outset that, to get back into the sport and to play, to clear you to play, we're going to expect you to be back at a certain score. Well, while we were going through, the athlete was still down pretty large amount. And one of the therapists I was working on him was really stressed about it because he was thinking about, periodization and long-term strength gains and said, at this rate, it's going to take weeks to get, say, 100 newtons, 150 newtons. Like if you were fresh and you were at 400, it might take you a couple training blocks to get you over 500. And I said, look, this person has it. Like they didn't actually lose it. This is they're guarding right now and they're not willing to put it, but it can literally happen at any moment where they get it back if we have the right exposures because it's still in there. It's only been a few weeks. Like you don't lose half your strength in 2 weeks, right? It's just they currently aren't accessing it for various reasons that injuries present. And so there's a stressful moment, but then not ironically, but coincidentally, 3, 4 days later, we had done a couple of different things that, got a little bit more into the hamstring work, more isolated work and dynamic work. And then we went back to it. And then his NordBord was basically back to where we expected for clearance. It was like 3 to 4 days after that incident. And that was just a really good learning point that if you have data on these things and you know where an athlete should be, you can totally expect an athlete to be back there in injury. And just because they're not there today does not mean that in 4 or 5 days, they might not have a huge jump because sometimes it's not the tissue, especially if therapist has their hands on them, tissue's feeling good. You do an isolated, static test and you say, oh, they're able to, with as much time as they want to an appreciable load, then you know that, okay, now we just have to get them to a place where they're comfortable at high speeds potentially doing this action. And that's all we're worried about, right? And so that's where you have to really look at multiple different tests to determine what's going on. That's what this last one is when you compare dynamic and static options, you're really trying to triangulate status of what is in that, what's wrong, still wrong with the athlete or what's keeping them from performing. Real examples of this in from the tissue to the sport and RTP, isolated strength at the joint muscle level should be your base of what you're trying to get first and make sure that you have. Dynamic results usually, like I said, going to be jumping, could be single leg and or bilateral, can be vertical, horizontal, lateral, depending on your sport and what you're doing all the time. You'll also have these high intensity threshold actions in your sport. So you have to think about what are the most intense individual actions and have I seen them yet, right? It could be accelerations or decelerations in basketball. It could be speed in any field or court-based sports. It could be stroke rate or power in a paddling sport. So that's something that you're going to want to see come along probably after the basic, tissue health and sort of base strengths have come along. And then the last thing for RTP, usually that you're making sure to layer on is chronic workload and fitness. How long has this person been at an adapted level of workload for? And could this be a problem if we reinsert them into normal conditions? We've mentioned the NBA a few times, but NBA has high competition loads and an extremely dense schedule. You're essentially playing every other day for 6 months and travel is just randomly thrown in and out there, changing time zones and things like that. So once an athlete gets the full go ahead to go in, that they're going to be exposed to a lot of this stress that you want to make sure like do they have the fitness and chronic workload to be back in there. So that's kind of how I build out RTP concepts with these different measures without getting too specific on each one. So the pattern for RTP is really what would it look like if one of your limbs was not acting normally? So does it take a little longer to get going in a jump? Is it, if you do single leg jumps, is it going at a different depth? If you're doing strength, does it not get to the same strength or take longer to do it? You're really just looking at what is this still a little different than normal? And lastly, Sherlock. I think it's the BBC version with Benedict Cumberbatch. So you got to just start thinking about what would Sherlock say or do? What are the patterns you're seeing in your data? Thank you very much. That's my Instagram and X handle. But yeah, I'm willing to open this up to questions now for anyone who wants to ask. I don't know what's been going on in the chat. I didn't see, so I'll leave that to Daniel or Nick to filter through. Stop sharing the screen.
Appreciate that, Cory. That was great.
Thanks, guys.
Like Cory mentioned, we can open up for questions. I've got a few of my own, but I'll wait to see if anyone else has any questions.
Cory, I got a question here.
Yeah.
So obviously, a lot of these tests, depending on where you're at, the context is obviously important. Considering I'm with a women's basketball team, a lot of these athletes, especially this year, are from abroad, so their exposure to like strength and conditioning might be not necessarily the same, and familiarity with these testing protocols. So priorly, I've been using IMTP tests. The issue we have currently is, for example, the setup is a little bit of an issue because I used to have, use straps and, getting in there, being able to test all the girls, it just takes a lot of time, and sometimes I just don't have that time. I considered switching to ISO back squat. The issue with the ISO back squat that I see is obviously the bending of the bar when you're pushing. What do you think about, that if that may be or not an issue during these tests? And obviously, I guess the best way to kind of do these is incorporating them within the test, I guess the session itself. How would you visualize that?
Yeah, there's kind of a few things. As an aside about the back squat, I remember trying it years ago and I did not love the compression feel on it. So I much prefer a belt squat. So you'd have to
Mhm.
figure out a couple different ways you could do it. You can either have an eyelet in the ground, or I have done it before where you can put chains on like either side of the rack that even out into the belt in the middle. The only thing about that is it's a little bit harder for you to control for position and make sure it's the same compared to a mid-thigh pull. Mid-thigh pull, once you're on the bar, it's a little easier to tweak people into the right space, right? You can pretty tell right away, like, wow, you're too bent over, or you're upright, or your knees aren't bent, or whatever. Squatting, there's a little bit more to play, but with some of the different things that have been done with, especially the eyelets in the floor and the I think a lot of places probably sell platforms now, and if they don't, you could probably build one really easily that's like 3 or 4 2x4s and you drill in your own eyelet. Um, if you have like one chain that goes straight from the bottom and you can kind of at least measure height. So what we did at the Kings, for example, is we had a chain where we labeled it so that
Mm,
you could write down like, you know, Luis is always tests on
yeah.
green, or maybe you have a number, maybe it's 72 inches or whatever, but could be colors or numbers. And then you just standardize that. And that way, that even if the position changes a little bit, it's likely not going to change the data very much unless it's, aggressively bad, like a person falling backwards and straightening fully out, which you hopefully are going to be able to catch that as a practitioner. And then building it into testing, what we usually do, what I've done in most of the places is one, like if you think majority of your people don't have it, then you make it like an exercise in testing a few times early on in your block. So as a strength exercise so that you can just give people more reps. And then the other thing is that you end up setting it up. So let's say you have an assistant in the room where you have some exercises that aren't too risky, then you say like, hey, on this week I'm testing the first 4 players in the roster, and during our Monday strength session, after the warm-ups and stuff, then they all come over and do their mid-thigh pull with me and then get back into their work. And so we would kind of in baseball, I'd say we have like your pre and post spring training testing that's where we take like a whole day to do everybody. But then in season, to try and get it monthly, that's what we would do, is you'd sort of like pick how many guys you sort of get through in a normal session where it's not crazy, and you build that into their strength. Their like main lift for the day is that test. And so you'd say, okay, and then maybe next Monday it's the next group of 5, and so that you as an individual practitioner can just kind of be away for like that's 20 minutes, that it takes to get, 4 people through a test. And then you're back in with the group, and then each Monday you get 4, and then by the time you've got through all of them, you might be back to trying to get them again if you're trying to do it monthly. If you're doing it every other month, you have some time. Those are the different suggestions. I think a squat is just as valid as an IMTP, but there's just a little bit more noise when it comes from that belt of the body, more degrees of freedom. I don't think the bending the bars can be significant, but like I said, I found it uncomfortable for myself. I felt like there's a lot of spinal compression, so you just have to be aware of that, of whether the athletes feel like when they really give it everything they have, that they feel comfortable with that. But if that, I'm not gonna ever tell you not to. Like, I don't think it's an invalid test, but check with your population, make sure, like, do you really feel like you can push all out on this comfortably? So those
Yeah,
are
for
kind of
sure.
my reactions there. And then I think that's how I would build it into your daily environment. It's like replace on a certain day your main strength exercise for certain people so that you can just do a few at a time.
Thank you for that. That makes a lot of sense. And one last thing. So another issue is obviously we don't have a particular setup, like for example, the stationary equipment where you don't have to necessarily carry the bar itself. In our case, we have to pick up the bar. So that's already 200 newtons.
Yeah.
And one thing I remember, like last year, we were testing and I weighed without the bar, obviously. But then I was thinking, oh, but I tested with the bar. So now that's like 200 newtons so how does that affect metrics? In that sense, how do you visualize this affecting any analysis at all?
It kind of washes out across the group in that, you don't have to worry about some athletes using a different bar, different weight. So you'd still want to test them without because that's their real weight.
Hmm.
And that just becomes the question, like, sometimes people like strength measures as relative, right? Weight per
Hmm.
kilogram, in which case you may or may not remove something like a bar. And other times you just say, hey, in this setup, there's a reality that everyone has to deal with. And so I'm still just setting a threshold that's an absolute value where you're either going to produce, 200 plus whatever else is there, and it's going to wash out in the norm across everyone to say, like,
Hmm.
my 3,000 is still what we expect. And it doesn't really matter that everyone has to use the same bar.
Gotcha. Thank you for that.
You're welcome.
Appreciate that, Luis. We have another question in the chat here from Sean. How much do you weigh force plate metrics compared to other streams of data? Follow-up being, when do you decide to alter practice or game workload?
So those to me are two different questions, which they're set that way. Number one, I weigh force plate data a lot. I think subjective information is valuable, but it can also be fuzzy based on a lot of things that are happening in their life. It's real, but you don't always know why. I like the idea of actionable performance data. Like your athlete is either creating force and movement at an elite level for themselves or below level. And that really I think tells me a lot more about whether or not an athlete's likely to perform in their sport. Saying that you feel tired and stuff, I'm going to assume you might be bad tonight, but I don't know. What if you went on there and you set a personal record on the force plate? Like your neuromuscular system's still okay. Subjectively, I still believe you that you're going through stuff. So I weigh force plates a lot, so probably more than equal parts. As for practice and game loads, to me, that's a lot of that is driven by the overall team loading of the past. So I don't really say your force plates are down, we shouldn't practice a lot. It's really usually practicing is set up in a way that you're building on your previous days and what's coming ahead. And I like to look at weight room and medical to try and tweak the sort of force plate stuff because I just think practice is such a big thing for tactical that you want to be careful not to limit it too much. You want the team to be available as much as possible, but it's also going to be a lot determined by the practice of yesterday and the game of tomorrow and etc. So when I'm usually consulting on practice loads, it's about what we've been doing and what we're about to do. When I look at the force plate data, I try to treat that a lot more individually. So talking with medical, talking with the strength coaches that are working with them, and potentially talking with the sport coach, but those people first on, okay, is this a normal response? If a player played, you went to overtime and played 41 minutes, then yes, we may expect to press force plate data the morning after. In which case it's like, hey, let's sit our recovery, try and get back to it. But if it's not expected, then it might be related to, is there an injury happening that we just haven't reported yet, right? Because most of us who are in high level sport know that there's a lot of things that hurt before there's an official injury that might require a stint on an IL or time out of a game. And so sometimes there's, hey, is something bothering you? Oh, actually, I kind of rolled my ankle yesterday. It's been okay. I actually see that in the force place data. Okay, now that we all know, let's work on it. Or sometimes it's, hey, let's take out a strength session. We're getting a little bit more tired than we need to be. Or, hey, we're actually going to start tweaking you to these high power movements and shorter sessions and not. So I usually, long story short, practice loads are related a lot more to the overall loading of practice and games that we're doing as a team. But individual force play data, I'm going to kind of look at individually and try and sort of lever the other things going on in their day before we think of taking them out of play or game situation.
Very well
Thanks.
said.
Thanks,
I
Sean.
think something that we could definitely dive into more. But for the sake of time, we have time for two more questions. One from Manny being, when tracking neuromuscular fatigue throughout the RTP process, are you finding more actionable insights in eccentric metrics like eccentric deceleration RFD or concentric output?
Yeah, I don't know if I would say it's always fatigue, but yes, I would say that I get a lot of info, especially at that, like, let's picture an RTP, a normal RTP of like a soft tissue injury that's in the, say, 2 to 3 week range. That's like what's going to happen more frequently than these bigger ones. Let's picture at this 3/4 mark, right? You have an athlete that's likely tissues mostly healed. They're starting to incorporate a lot of basic activities. What I usually find is that eccentric phase is sometimes the thing that's most depressed at the end. And I liken it to an athlete. I usually use the term trust. I say an athlete who still doesn't quite trust that limb or that injury or that area or whatever we're going to talk about, that joint, is usually going to show that by just not loading it quite as quickly. And so you'll usually see this delay from one limb to the other, in which case you might say, hey, they're still hitting the same, peak force, and they might actually hit a similar jump height and say a single leg jump. But if it's loading a lot slowly, then they're just not trusting to get into it the way they would when they're healthy. And that, unfortunately, is what happens in elite competition when the adrenaline's flowing and you've got a competitor who's really good and you have to do this or else, that's your job. We have to have that blind trust into loading as quickly as possible. And yes, I do find that it's very usually the eccentric at that like 80% stage is usually the most telling thing that, like, yes, we're not quite there, or yes, we're at this place where this athlete trusts that limb or that joint to load as quickly as they used to or as much as the other leg. So that's a good question. I definitely agree that eccentric pro, especially late stage, is the last thing to sort of show that you want to clear before you go.
And then last one here for this evening from Jared. He mentioned that was great. He thanks you for your time. He was wondering about the interpersonal piece between yourself and the staff in a team setting and like the actual sport coaches. So the question is, what were the biggest challenges and opportunities in bringing this data to their attention? And did it enact any changes in their process?
Yeah, it's always different. It's different everywhere you go. I can tell you in a bunch of different environments, different reactions they've had and different ways that they've used it. Um, I always think like your foundation is your medical and performance team, right? There's no reason today with our educations and what we use that you shouldn't be able to convince everyone on board that these are key metrics we're looking at and what they mean, right? And that should help drive those conversations of what are we treating? How are we treating it? What are we training? How are we training it? What do we expect to see return to play? When it goes over to the sport coach side, you have to really, one, do your best to, you know, win the trust of your coaches by being inquisitive to what they're doing and what they care about. And then also bringing along and really slowly, I'll call them edible steps of like, hey, this just tells us, jump height's super important. It tells us that an athlete is explosive, right? And then you slowly get into more and more. Actually, there's more on the force plates that we can get to that sometimes you have a coach that there's certain aspects that if I bring this to the coach, he's not gonna listen to it, and he's not gonna change his practice on it. Then don't, right? Stop. Just say, okay, I'm gonna bring in that. Hey, just so you know, coach, I really think based on what we've seen, the players are gassed, right? Maybe that's it. Maybe it's just super basic, my opinion from our department, players are gassed, blah, blah, blah. And then the rest of your team knows the detail to which you might be looking at this. Some coaches don't care to hear that detail, and unfortunately, that's just how life is, and you have to kind of judge it as you're going when you present a piece of data. Does the coach sound like they're curious? Are they listening? Are they saying how do we use it? Or is it just, okay, I know I'm not going to show them that report next time. I'm just going to tell them, hey, I'm worried about Johnny. Just so you know, medical performance is worried about Johnny, that he might be a little limber. Maybe he doesn't do the scrimmage today. You think that's reasonable? And then you go from there. So I think you tread lightly, not try to keep hammering them with data if they don't seem like they care about it. And there's a good chance you're going to work with coaches through your entire career that don't want to hear some of the nerdy force plate data and different things. But there's no reason why your medical performance teams shouldn't all be aligned on what it means for their practice and how you're using it like directly with the players. So you may have an environment where you're very science driven with your players, and yet with the coach, it's a different conversation. It's just a very simple, good to go, not good to go. And then if they ever say, hey, why did you say that? Makes you think that? Then you can slowly tip into, well, we have all these metrics that we've been gathering data for 4 years. This is, we have tons of it. This is way below his normal, right? And I had that happen in the NBA with one player where I just said, hey, by the way, I have kind of a red flag on a guy. A bunch of these metrics are just way below his norm, right? Like, just imagine that if he lives here all the time, this is here right now, we don't ever see that. Just, do you respect that? And it was like, yeah, I respect that. So the long and short is that you're not going to always get them to like data. So you just have to kind of go softly with present it and see how they take it the first time. And if you don't think you have it, then just learn how to say, okay, when am I going to say something when my data tells me I should really be concerned? Because you'll feel guilty if you don't, right? That's your job. But you could just say, I'm concerned. We have concerns about whether this guy should play today or whether this guy should do all of it or whether this guy should take a breather. And then you let the conversation guide you. But with your own teams, your interdisciplinary teams, you should have strong systems that are evidence-based where you say, like, we're going off data for a very specific reason.
Yeah, that's an important point because you're going to be eager with the information that you have, but meeting the coaching staff and the different departments with where they're at and their communication preferences and the visualization preferences and the information preferences. Like you said, sometimes they're not always open to that, but it's great to have the alignment and yourself and as a medical and performance staff having that and operating in a way that it's efficient and useful for you. Then they'll have the trickle effect down the road when needed. So I think that's a very important point and a great question and follow up. But again, I just wanted to wrap it up here. Again, any other questions that you guys have, we have our Instagram page at CPSS Prep. We'll be able to connect with Cory if you guys have any questions outside of that. Cory, thank you so much for your time tonight. Everyone on the call, thank you all so much for hopping on a Friday evening. Finishing up a busy week. Hopefully you all have a great weekend and looking forward to many more CPSS Prep webinars. So again, thank you all for your time. Cory, thank you again for your time. And again, look forward to doing this again soon.
Thank you, Nick
Thank
and
you,
Daniel, for
Cory.
inviting me.